Undercover boss orders, coffee freezes when she admits tips don't pay rent very early. Outside, the sky was still foggy. The sunlight had just touched the maple trees in front of the shop. Inside Maple Street Cafe, a small franchise branch of Sunrise Cafe, the morning began like any other. The scent of baked goods drifted from the kitchen. Glasses clinked softly. The espresso machine hissed in steady bursts. Customers sat scattered throughout, mostly early shift workers, driver's office employees, and a young teacher. At a table by the window, a man around 50 turned the pages of a leather notebook. In his hand was a cup of black coffee, no milk, no sugar. No one knew he was Michael Foster, founder of Sunrise Cafe. Today, he came without an assistant. No suit. And he wasn't here to check brand compliance. He came for something else, something deeper. A waitress brought coffee to the next table.
Slim-build hair, tied neatly, gentle eyes.
She leaned in and whispered to a coworker behind the counter, "I don't know if I can afford rent this month. Tips yesterday weren't enough for the bus." Her voice was small, raspy, but Michael heard every word. No one reacted. The customer just smiled, said, "Thank you," and went back to their phone. The coworker nodded, said nothing. But Michael looked up, followed her with his eyes. That girl, early 20s, probably named Lily, if he heard correctly. While working, she still smiled at customers' clean tables gently. But something in her movements made him stop writing. She wasn't just tired. She was performing a role no one should have to play to earn pity. An older male customer nearby whispered to his companion,
She's a good kid.
"Her mom's sick. Still works 2 shifts a day." Michael stayed silent. But in his notebook, he added 2 lines, "Lily tips, not enough for bus. Family has medical issue." Then something unusual caught his eye. Lily had just received a tip from a customer. She looked around, then quickly tucked it into her inner shirt pocket instead of putting it in the communal tip jar. She turned away like nothing happened. But Michael saw her expression before she did, wary, anxious. The shift manager, a woman in a dark blouse, stood behind the counter. Sharp demeanor, always watching like she was scanning for any wrong move. She glanced at Lily, didn't speak, just wrote something on a clipboard, then disappeared into the back. Michael checked his watch. 7:43 a.m. He had been there almost 30 minutes. But in that short time, with just one whisper, one hidden tip, and one manager's look, he knew he wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. Tips.
Something seemingly small.
But within the Sunrise system, it stood for gratitude acknowledgement. More importantly, it should never be controlled by anyone except the person who earned it. Michael had made it clear all tips must belong to the recipient. No one, not even managers, had the right to pool, withhold, or redistribute them. But Lily had just hidden her tip. Why, he continued observing. An older female customer tried handing Lily a tip directly. The manager stepped in swiftly. "Just leave it here, ma'am." "We'll handle it." Handle it? What did that mean? Michael turned to a new page in his notebook. An uncomfortable feeling spread through him. This wasn't just about one tired employee or low tips. This was about a system functioning incorrectly right beneath the brand he had protected like his own child. A regular customer walked in, struck up a conversation with Michael, assuming he was a stranger new here. Don't let their smiles fool you. "There's something going on." Michael nodded, feigning ignorance. What kind of something? The man looked around, then whispered, "Tip sharing." "I think they take it all." I saw one of the waitresses, Rachel, before she quit, argue with the manager about not getting her share. Rachel, the waitress who used to work here. Michael wrote down the name. Another piece of the puzzle. Things were starting to come together like a distorted painting slowly being corrected. No one could see Michael's expression at that moment. But his eyes had changed. The coffee cup in his hand was no longer just a morning drink. It had become a silent witness to something being hidden. He leaned back slightly, took another slow sip, but inside his thoughts were spinning. Lily talked about rent. She hid her tip money in her shirt. A regular mentioned a former server, Rachel, who had quit. The manager always appeared at just the right moment when someone tried to give a tip directly. Something wasn't right, and Michael knew he couldn't just sit here and take notes. He had come to Maple Street Cafe intending only to observe. Now he was about to investigate. And the story had just begun. Maple Street Cafe sat on a quiet corner in East Portland. Red brick buildings faded behind the early morning mist. A wooden sign, slightly crooked, swayed in the wind above the glass door. The shop opened at 6 a.m., and by almost 8, it was nearly full. Inside, the warmth contrasted the chilly street outside.
Sunlight filtered through white curtains, casting soft golden beams across the tables.
Old jazz music played softly from a small speaker above the pastry case. The sound of cutlery on porcelain order calls and soft laughter from regulars painted a scene that seemed peaceful. Michael Foster sat at a wall-side table near the service counter. He wore a light brown wool coat collar slightly askew, like an aging writer jotting down fragments of life. A beanie pulled low covered his graying hair. Round glasses and a worn leather notebook helped him blend in without attracting attention. To the staff, he was just a quiet, polite, early morning customer who seemed vaguely familiar. But in truth, he was doing something he rarely mentioned publicly, an anonymous audit. Emily, the lead server for the morning shift, moved briskly, always smiling as she poured coffee or delivered toast. But Michael noticed something out of step. Not in her service, in her eyes. Whenever she turned away from customers, her gaze drifted off into blank space as if weighing something heavy. She often bit her lip softly, then exhaled when she thought no one was watching. A middle-aged customer left a $5 bill beside his cappuccino cup. Emily calmly swept by picking it up like routine. But instead of putting it into the tip jar on the counter where all staff shared, she slipped it into her apron pocket and quickly disappeared into the back area. Michael noted the action. No judgment. Just a note. From the kitchen, he could hear Tom, the head chef, grumbling about an order mistake. Toast was supposed to be dry. Who put butter on it? Tom was about 40, thin, balding, raspy voice. He rarely spoke to customers, but with people he knew he usually nodded and smiled. Yet when Linda, the shift manager, entered, his tone shifted. He went silent.
Turned his face slightly as if trying to avoid her gaze.
Linda always showed up at just the right time. Whenever a customer left, she was the one who saw them out beaming, always asking, "Was everything all right for you?" But Michael noticed her demeanor cooled when no customers were around.
Staff tended to shrink away when she was nearby.
Once a middle-aged customer finished her mocha and pulled out a $10 bill saying to Emily, "Thank you, sweetheart. Keep this." Emily smiled and reached out. But Linda stepped in gently but firmly. "Just leave it here. We'll pool and divide it later." The customer looked a little confused but didn't object. Michael, however, gripped the edge of his notebook slightly tighter. An action not too unusual. But when repeated, it's no longer just procedure. After the customer left, Michael saw Emily go to the back. She opened a cabinet near the espresso machine and pulled out a small box labeled with the letter E. She quickly placed some money inside, closed the cabinet, returned to the front like nothing had happened. Michael had seen situations like this before. A pooled tip system meant to be fair. But if it lacks transparency, it can become a tool. A tool for someone to control everything while those on the front lines pay the price. Not everyone dares to speak up. And not every voice gets believed. Michael continued writing private box hidden near the espresso machine. Emily avoids Linda's gaze when opening it. The longer he sat, the more familiar the feeling became, a pressure-filled environment hidden beneath layers of rehearsed smiles. Small details wove themselves together. A dishwashing staff member brought out a time card to ask Linda about last week's hours and got ignored. Tom glanced at the wall clock and muttered another 30 minutes unpaid. The cafe remained filled with sunlight. Customers still laughed and chatted. But Michael knew some truths were hiding in plain sight. And that morning, in the peaceful hum of a cafe, he began tracing the signs. Not to assess profits, but to understand how many people had to force a smile just to be seen as cheerful. Michael sat still, gently twirling his pen on the page. His coffee had gone cold long ago, but he never took another sip. His ears strained toward the counter where Emily stood beside the espresso machine. "I just want to do my job, not have to think up tricks to survive on spare change," a soft, tired female voice trembling with exhaustion. Michael glanced subtly over the rim of his glasses. It was the voice of Jess, the new dishwasher. She'd only been working a few weeks, but had already learned the unspoken rules of this place. Nearby, the barista, early 20s, hair tied back, was drying cups. He leaned in and whispered, "Emily keeps asking for evening shifts, but Linda won't approve them. Says her face looks too tired. Might ruin the vibe." Michael stayed silent, but something in his chest tightened. That phrase, "looks too tired," hit him like a fist. Not because it was cruel, but because it was too familiar. How many times had he heard that exact phrase in high-level meetings used to quantify customer experience, but now it was attached to a real person? Emily, the young woman who had just bowed and thanked a guest in the softest voice, but whose lips couldn't hide the fatigue. Michael opened his notebook and wrote assigned morning shifts consistently. Request for more hours denied due to facial expression. And as if fate wanted him to see more, a middle-aged man in a worn leather jacket, sipping espresso by the door, leaned over and murmured that girl used to sleep in her car for weeks. At first, I thought she was joking, but one morning at 6 a.m., I saw her dozing behind the steering wheel. Michael looked at the man. He shrugged like someone who didn't want to meddle. I asked. She just smiled and said, "Guess I'm still luckier than some." That sentence made Michael pause. He looked over at Emily, who was carefully wiping down a table for the next guest. Her movements steady, gentle, no sign of distress. But he knew this wasn't calm. It was total focus, a concentration so sharp it held together a life already too fragile. The emotional drop landed quietly, but deeply. No tears. Just a small piece of truth, enough to make viewers instinctively take Emily's side. Michael wrote again, slept in her car. No complaints, saw it as being lucky. No one in the caf knew that someone was documenting their lives in even strokes of ink. But story by story, whisper by whisper, they were becoming a larger picture. A picture Michael, as the founder of this entire caf chain, had never wanted to see forming in the very place he had built on trust. Emily stepped out from the kitchen carrying a croissant for a takeout order. As she leaned down to place it, her eyes locked with Michael's. Just for a second, as quick as a blink, but enough. Enough for him to see something no spreadsheet or dashboard could ever measure: resignation. And something else, something equal parts ashamed and unbreakable. A glance that seemed to say, "I'm fine." Really? But Michael wasn't fine. And he knew the audience wouldn't be fine either. Because from this point forward, the story had found its center. Not the system. Not the policies. But a young woman trying to smile to hide the cold nights she spent sleeping in her car and the fear that this week she might not be able to make rent. Michael closed his notebook. The real journey had just begun. He wasn't in a rush. He stayed for another hour after the morning rush, scribbling into his notebook, watching every move like a curious regular. But in truth, every question he asked from that moment on had intent, like the first deliberate strikes of a shovel, slow but firm, meant to unearth what lay buried beneath. The first person he approached was Will, the young barista. Michael waited until Will was wiping down the espresso machine, then asked, "How long have you been working here?" Will hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Almost 8 months. Pay-okay." Will glanced quickly toward the register where Linda stood, then looked down. "It's all right. It's just sometimes it feels weird." Weird. Michael leaned in slightly as if listening to an interesting story.
"Some days," Will said softly, "I see a lot of tips left by customers.
But at the end of the month, what I actually get is way less." His voice trailed off. "If you ask about it, your shifts get cut right away." Michael said nothing. He simply nodded and wrote in his notebook, "Fear of punishment silences the truth." Then he waited until lunch break when Tom, the head cook, stepped out back for a cigarette in the alley behind the caf. Michael brought his coffee with him, leaning casually against the wall near Tom.
Eyes a bit weak today, huh? Tom chuckled, voice raspy.
Old espresso machine. No one wants to replace it. They traded a few harmless comments. Then Michael asked quietly, "What do you think about the way tips are handled here?" Tom fell silent, as if weighing whether to speak. Then he sighed, eyes falling to the tiled ground. "Linda keeps it all. Staff aren't allowed to hold on to anything. Even if it's just loose change, if a guest leaves a single coin, we're told to give it straight to her. Why's that store policy? If you're caught keeping a tip even $5, you're gone. No questions asked." Michael gave a slight nod. His eyes, cold, now didn't hide his disapproval. He wrote, "No one dares accept kindness because generosity has been labeled a violation." And finally, there was Emily. Still energetic. Still smiling at every table.
Still offering thanks even to customers who only ordered a small coffee.
But Michael noticed the subtle cues. Her gaze lingered for a few seconds whenever she checked the clock or passed the tip jar tucked at the edge of the counter. At the end of the day, as everyone began cleaning up, Linda handed out payslips to each staff member. Emily took her folded paper creased into fourths and slipped it into her apron pocket without looking. But Michael, sitting at the nearby corner table, saw it clearly. As she turned away, her hand gripped the hem of her uniform. Her thumb trembled for a split second before she stuffed it into her pocket as if trying to steady herself. She said nothing. No complaints. No visible emotion. But Michael saw everything. Not with his eyes, but with the intuition of a man who once built a business from nothing and had seen good people forced into silence just to keep a job. He wrote in his notebook, "The smile is real, but it's pressed onto a face carrying too much." Michael sat for a while longer. The caf was nearly empty. Emily was wiping down the last table. Each movement was deliberate, not because of policy, but as if it were the only thing she could control today. As he stepped out the front door, Michael turned for one last look through the window. In that faded cream-colored uniform, Emily stood by the espresso machine, a part of the cafe presence no one noticed yet always there. No one could see what she was enduring. But now Michael knew. And so did the audience. Because from this moment on, they were no longer just viewers. They were companions joining a CEO as he followed the scattered pieces of a system that was quietly allowing the worst things to happen in the very place he had placed his trust. And he knew the confrontation was just beginning. Michael stood closing his leather notebook as if completing the final item on a list of things he came to observe. He walked up to the counter where Linda was reviewing receipts on the POS screen. The caf had grown quiet, the morning shift nearing its end, customers slowly heading out. But in that silence, each of Michael's footsteps felt heavier, as if carrying a decision not yet spoken. Linda kept smiling. A smile that reached the lips but never the eyes. Michael leaned an arm against the counter, his voice soft, even like a curious guest. "Excuse me, may I ask, how are the tips divided here?" Linda paused. Just for a fraction of a second, her eyes flickered with hesitation. But then her face returned to normal, her voice soft, too soft for the tension that had just filled the air. "We pool them every weekend, then divide evenly. It's company policy." She tilted her head and smiled, still tapping smoothly on the register as if the question didn't warrant attention. Michael didn't nod in agreement. He only nodded to indicate that he'd registered every word. Behind Linda's polite tone, Michael heard something else. He heard vagueness. He heard a policy spoken like a shield, never questioned, never verified. He looked down at the small transparent tip jar beside the espresso machine. 3 crumpled $1 bills and a few coins inside. In that moment, he recalled Emily's eyes that morning when she mentioned yesterday's tips weren't even enough for a bus ride. And now, in front of him, stood the person claiming that everything was divided fairly. Michael didn't respond to her explanation. He simply smiled. But his eyes were no longer those of a customer. They were the eyes of an owner reading between the lines and seeing exactly what needed to be done. He returned to his table, pulled out his phone, typed out a message, sent it. From the back, Emily stepped out of the kitchen holding a tray with a muffin for a customer who'd added to their order. She hadn't heard the conversation just now, but Michael was watching her every small movement, the way she kept smiling even though her eyes seemed completely hollow. He looked more closely, saw Will washing glasses in the corner, saw Chef Tom quietly wiping down the counter even though the kitchen shift had ended. All three, each holding a story they hadn't told. And Michael knew if he didn't speak up, no one would speak for them. He wrote one more line in his notebook: "The silence here doesn't come from contentment. It comes from the fear of being replaced." The cave still smelled of warm coffee spoons, clinked against plates, conversations hummed in corners. But inside the mind of the CEO, a new blueprint had begun to take shape. Not a recipe, not an expansion plan, but the layout of a reform. A reform that would begin with the truth, even if it started with something as small as a whispered sentence. Yesterday's tips weren't even enough for a bus ride. From a reply that wasn't entirely honest, it's company policy. And from the moment Michael realized that fairness doesn't live in policy papers, but in how people are treated when no one's watching, he closed the notebook. Everything was just beginning. Michael removed his glasses. He placed them on the wooden table, turned around, and spoke slowly into the air that had now frozen mid-morning. "I'm Michael Foster, founder of Sunrise Cafe." The sound sliced through Maple Street Cafe like a gust of cold wind. Everything froze. Spoons midair. Heads turned. Kitchen staff looked through the service window, and Linda, standing behind the counter, went rigid in a single breath. The permanent smile on her face vanished. Michael stepped toward the counter. He was no longer the quiet man scribbling in a leather-bound notebook. He was the architect of the system, and now he was confronting the cracks inside it. He opened his phone. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The franchise cooperation agreement with Sunrise Cafe is very clear. Customer tips belong to the server. They must be distributed in real time with transparency. No one has the right to withhold, delay, or control that money. Linda started to speak, but her voice only made it halfway. Michael didn't look at her. He tilted his head toward the door. A man walked in wearing a dark brown coat, a name badge on his chest. Regional supervisor. In his hand, a tablet already queued up. No announcements. No words exchanged. He tapped play. The screen lit up with security footage from four corners of the cafe over the past 2 weeks. One clip, Linda gathering tips from the jars at the end of each shift, placing them in sealed envelopes, then storing them in the bottom drawer unlocked. Another, Emily asking about her Saturday tip share. Linda smiles but says blandly, "Sales were low this week. We'll roll it into next week." And then the clip that made the entire cafe hold its breath, Linda bending down, whispering to Will, the barista, "Your smile's a little weak this week. I'm reviewing your hours for next month." The truth needed no drama. It stood there, clear, cold, undeniable. Emily stood frozen against the wall, her hands trembling. Tom furrowed his brow, pressed his lips, tight eyes, saying, "How did this go on so long without anyone saying anything?" Michael kept his eyes on Linda. There was no anger, only a quiet resolve tinged with disappointment. He spoke slowly, but every word hit like a nail being driven in. "We do not hire people who make staff feel like they have to perform just to be allowed to exist. No one has the right to decide someone else's income based on an imposed level of cheerfulness." Linda lowered her head. No justification. The entire cafe fell silent. A few customers set their coffee cups down, nodding gently. They had heard. They had seen. And now they were witnessing someone actually standing up for those who had never dared to speak. Michael turned to the regional supervisor. "I want a full report by this afternoon. Include pay history, tips, and feedback from both morning and evening shifts over the last 3 months." He stepped back, his gaze no longer on Linda, but now turned to each member of the team. "The truth didn't come out today because I'm here. The truth has always been there. Today, someone simply chose to face it." Will gave a slight nod. Emily, for the first time all morning, stood upright, her eyes no longer avoiding contact. And Tom, the usually quiet head chef, placed a hand on the counter, as if he had just laid down a weight he'd carried for far too long. Michael didn't say anything else. He didn't need to.
The room had spoken for him.
Not in words, but in the shift of posture and the change of gaze and the rise of long-buried confidence. Right now, viewers weren't just seeing a CEO expose misconduct. They were witnessing something more. That goodness finally had someone on its side. Michael turned to Emily. She was still standing at the corner of the counter, both hands clasped tightly as if she still couldn't believe what had just happened. Her eyes lifted slightly as she saw him approaching, but instead of reprimand, he quietly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thin beige envelope. "You don't have to live in fear anymore." His voice was low but clear. The calf fell into a hush again. He handed the envelope to Emily, his eyes never leaving her face, which was now trembling with emotion. Inside were 3 things. A new contract full-time with stable hours and full health insurance. A rental support card covering the next 3 months personally approved by the CEO's office. And a transit pass for unlimited public transportation access across the city. Emily opened the envelope, looking at each item as if they had just fallen from a world she never believed she could reach. She pressed her lips together. Her throat tightened. "Why?" she whispered. Michael gave a soft smile. "Because you deserve it. Not because you smile a lot or customers like you, but because you always did the right thing even when no one was watching." He turned around. The whole team was looking at him, eyes filled with hesitation, caution, and somewhere hope. Michael stepped into the center of the floor, where now there was no grinder noise, no trays of baked goods, just people. He spoke, no microphone, no theatrics. "Starting today, all tips will be processed through a real-time system. No one is allowed to collect, withhold, delay, or grade your emotions before letting you receive what you've rightfully earned. We don't hire people who know how to say nice things. We choose those who do the right things. No background music." Yet the entire room from the bar to the back kitchen seemed to swell in silence.
Tom set down his knife.
The barista looked up, then started clapping. 1 clap. Then a few more. And then the entire calf erupted in applause. Not because Michael was the CEO. Not because there were cameras rolling, but because for the first time fairness arrived, and it arrived immediately without delay. Emily lowered her head. This time not to pour coffee, but to hide the tears welling in her eyes. She knew this wasn't just the day she signed a contract. It was the day she believed she no longer had to perform, no longer had to strain just to be seen as worthy. Linda by now had been escorted out by the regional supervisor. No one gloated. No one muttered insults, because the truth had already done that job itself. As the calf door closed behind Linda, Maple Street calf seemed to breathe a little lighter. Michael stood still for a moment, observing everyone one by one. Then he nodded and walked back to the window table where he had begun the morning. The coffee was cold now, but his gaze had never been clearer.
Because what he had just witnessed was not a problem that needed fixing.
It was an opportunity to make things right, to start again, to build from the place that touches people, not numbers. Viewers who stayed this long weren't just watching a CEO expose someone. They were witnessing step by step a real leader rebuild a system, not with slogans, but with clear, tangible actions right there on the ground. They weren't just satisfied that the good had been uplifted. They were moved because, for the first time, the kind were protected. Right when they needed it most. Michael walked out of the calf just as the afternoon sun angled down over the tree-lined street. The soft golden light painted the pavement in a peaceful glow, but one strong enough to make him pause in front of the calf's large glass window. Reflected in the glass was the silhouette of a man with salt and pepper hair, a plain brown coat, and a worn leather notebook in his hand. It was him, Michael Foster, a man who once thought he knew every corner of the system he had built with his own hands. But today he had learned something more valuable than any financial report he had ever read. In that hazy reflection, he also saw Emily clearing a table in the calf's corner.
Her eyes gentler but steadier than they had been that morning.
No longer anxious. No longer weighed down. but standing taller with a quiet belief that she was worthy of respect. Michael stared at that image for a long moment. Then he nodded, not to end the day, but to begin something clearer. A cup of coffee, he thought, can warm a morning. But a system that listens, that protects, can warm a soul for a lifetime. No slogans. No press releases. Just one right decision at the right moment for the right person. Michael took out his phone, typed the first message to headquarters, update the entire tip system. Real time. No intermediaries. Second message, create an independent review team to collect feedback directly from staff at each branch. Third message, the only question we must ask ourselves every day is whether the kind have been protected yet. A small bird glided across the late afternoon sky. Michael looked up. Then he turned his back to Maple Street Cafe, neither rushing nor dawdling, as if closing one chapter to begin another. Clearer. Better. The story ends, but the viewers do not walk away. They were still reflecting on every word, every action, every moment when fairness was no longer just a distant concept, but something that could happen if someone had the courage to do the right thing. Because after everything, the audience didn't just witness the truth being revealed. They walked alongside a man from surprise to anger to resolve and deep humanity. And as the screen slowly fades, a quiet sense of relief remains, along with a single lingering thought echoing in the viewer's mind: fairness sometimes doesn't live in applause. It lives in the choice of a man who, after hearing a whisper, chose not to turn away. This wasn't just Emily's story. It was the story of hundreds of thousands of silent workers, those who never believed that one day their small voice might be heard, and answered with a fair decision, immediate and made without asking anyone's permission.